Here we go. Thank you and welcome to the Humanities Forum. Today we are excited, well first we're excited to welcome you guys here. There's a great turnout. I know it's terrible that Providence didn't make the NC2As, but it freed up the Friday afternoon schedule. So hopefully your guys' brackets are doing well. Thank you for coming out, and thank you for coming to the Humanities Forum. The Humanities Forum is what are we, about five-year-old initiative of the Civ program, trying to bring the discussions that we have in Civ and elsewhere on campus into the community and into our lives. And in that, I'd first like to welcome you. I am Patrick Breen, professor of history and history and classics, and I'd like to welcome you here to this day's lecture. Our speaker today, we're very fortunate, very lucky to have Anne Applebaum with us. Anne Applebaum graduated from Yale University, school in Connecticut, with a we've heard of it, with a degree, with dual degrees in history and literature. She then went on and went to the London School of Economics, where she got a master's in international relations. Following her graduate school, she went and learned her trade as a journalist, working at many British publications, including one of the best known in America, The Economist, where, among other things, she was a very young African editor of the African desk. Is that right? Something like that. So while she's learning that, she also, while other historians would often be in graduate school, she's learning her trade as a journalist. But she's still interested in history. And I think one of the great things about having Anne Applebaum here is she's doing history not from the trained academic position, but from the position of a journalist, which approaches the audience in a different way than academic historians. Her work as a historian has been incredibly successful. She's got 3 major books: Gulag, Iron Curtain, and most recently, Red Famine. Gulag, her first book, the equivalent of one of your professor's dissertation, won a Pulitzer. So that's a pretty good job, congratulations. She's also got other books, including, if I'm not mistaken, as I read your webpage, a Polish cookbook. There you go. So Mary, you may have questions after my daughter Mary loves cooking, so there you go. She also runs a program on disinformation campaigns at the London School of Economics. Her experience as both a journalist and a historian really gives her a great position to talk about the importance of history today. I think when I teach history classes, I ask 3 questions of my students when they read a book. You know, what is the argument? What is the evidence? And what's the implication? And one of the things I think that as a historian I do the worst job on, and I think as a profession the academic historians do the worst job on, is what is the implication? We teach you how, if you're a history major, you take history classes, we teach you how to do history. But one of the reasons we do history is not just to learn these analytic skills or to learn what happened in the past, but to learn to think about our world in different ways. And I think we're really blessed to have Anne Applebaum here today with her perspective, her background, and her training to talk about, what is the title of your talk? I don't have it written down. The Gulag. Okay, so what we know now and why it matters. So with that, no more further ado, let's welcome Anne Applebaum.
So, thank you very much for that fulsome introduction, which reminds me of a famous story about Henry Kissinger, who at a event much like this one was standing in front of an audience, and somebody came up and introduced him, and they said, "And now we will hear from Dr. Kissinger, who of course needs no introduction." And Henry Kissinger stood up, and I cannot do his accent, but he said, "I may not need an introduction, but I so enjoy them." So thank you very much. Thank you very much. So to set a little bit the historical context, I'll begin by pointing out that we have only just passed the 66th anniversary of Stalin's death. Joseph Stalin, the general secretary, leader of the Communist Party and of the Soviet Union. And in commemoration of that event, I'll read you a very short excerpt from the memoirs of his daughter Svetlana, who sat by his deathbed until the very end. For the last 12 hours, she wrote, the lack of oxygen became acute, the death agony was terrible, he literally choked to death as we watched. At what seemed to be the very last moment, he opened his eyes and cast a glance over everyone in the room. It was a terrible glance, insane or perhaps angry, and full of the fear of death. Within days of Stalin's demise, Beria, his henchman, his leader of his secret police, and then Khrushchev, his successor, they began dismantling what was one of the Soviet leader's signature achievements, namely his concentration camps. They did so for many reasons. Some of them had wives and relatives in the camps. Some feared retribution from others who did. Most of all, though, they did so because the camps were an economic disaster, about which more in a moment, and potentially a political disaster, too. Nobody knew better than Stalin's Politburo how many people imprisoned within them were innocent. Yet, although they knew this, none of Stalin's Soviet successors, not Khrushchev, not Leonid Brezhnev, and not in the end even Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, was far-seeing enough or politically powerful enough to finish the job. As a result, both the economic and the moral legacy of the camps continue to distort Russian society today. One might say that Stalin is dead, but his last gaze, his terrible gaze, still casts its shadow. But although the legacy of the Gulag and of Stalinism will be the ultimate subject of my talk today, I'm going to begin with a very brief account of what we have learned about the camp since the time of Stalin's death, and in particular what we know now that we did not know at the time Solzhenitsyn wrote Gulag Archipelago, a book that I know lots of people on campus are reading right now. In the years I spent researching my book on the Gulag, I concluded that archives, which I had and Solzhenitsyn did not, do make a difference to how we understand Soviet history. So in the 1990s, after the Soviet Union's collapse, I was able to work in archives in Moscow and Karelia. I had access to documents from archives in St. Petersburg, Perm, Vorkuta, Kolyma, Novosibirsk. At one point, I was handed a part of the archive of a small camp called Kedrovy Shore in the far north, and I was politely asked if I wanted to buy it, which I did. It's now at the Hoover Institution. What was available to me was often quite ordinary. These were the day-to-day archives of the Gulag administration, for example, with inspectors' reports and financial accounts, letters from camp directors to their supervisors in Moscow. But when reading these documents, the full extent of this system and its importance to the Soviet economy did come sharply into focus. So the documents enabled me to be far more precise than was ever possible in the past. Thanks to archives, we now know, for example, that there were at least 476 camp systems in the Soviet Union, each one made up of hundreds or even thousands of individual camps or lagpunkts. Sometimes these were spread out over thousands of square miles of otherwise empty tundra. Each one of these camps had a kind of economic specialty, or most of them did. Mining, forestry, sometimes packaging. They were usually organized around some kind of economic enterprise. But we also know that the vast majority of the prisoners in them were peasants and workers and not the intellectuals who later wrote memoirs and books. We also know that with a few exceptions, the camps were not constructed, this makes them different from some of Hitler's camps, they were not constructed in order to kill people. Stalin preferred to use firing squads to conduct his mass executions. Nevertheless, they were at times very lethal. Nearly a quarter of the Gulag's prisoners died during the war years. They were very fluid. Prisoners came and went. They left because they died, because they escaped, because they had short sentences, because they were being released into the Red Army, or because they had been promoted from prisoner to guard, as happened. There were frequent amnesties for the old, for the ill, for pregnant women, and for anyone who was no longer useful to the forced labor system. And these releases were invariably followed by new waves of arrests. But that means that, as a result, between 1929, when they first became a mass phenomenon, and 1953, the year of Stalin's death, some 18 million people passed through the Soviet Gulag. In addition, a further 6 or 7 million people were deported, not to camps, but to exile villages. And in total, that means that the number of people with some experience of imprisonment in Stalin's Soviet Union could have run as high as 25 million, which is about 15% of the population. So 1 in 6 people. Not all of those imprisoned in the Soviet system were Soviet citizens. In the course of writing another book on the Soviet repression of Eastern Europe after the Second World War, I also uncovered the extent of Stalin's camps in that part of the world too. After the war's end, 6 new concentration camps, Soviet camps, were opened in Eastern Germany, and 2 of them, in Sachsenhausen and Buchenwald, were on the very same sites that had been used by Hitler. More than 150,000 Germans were sentenced to them, this is in kind of 1949, 1950, of whom about a third died of starvation and illness. Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria also opened prison work camps. In Poland, there were mass arrests, but no camps. Polish prisoners were sent straight into the Soviet Gulag. Like Soviet prisoners, these foreign prisoners could end up absolutely anywhere. We are all familiar, or those of us who have read Solzhenitsyn's novels are familiar with the image of a prisoner in a snowstorm digging coal with a pickaxe. But there were also camps in central Moscow where prisoners built apartment blocks or designed airplanes. There were camps in Krasnoyarsk where prisoners ran nuclear power plants. There were fishing camps on the Pacific coast. There were collective farm camps in Central Asia. The Gulag photo albums in the Russian State Archive, which I once got to look through, are chock full of pictures of prisoners with their camels. So from Akhtubinsk to Yakutsk, there was not a single major population center that did not have its own local camp or camps, and not a single industry that did not employ prisoners. And over the years, prisoners built roads and railroads, power plants, and chemical factories. They manufactured weapons, furniture, even children's toys. So that means that in the Soviet Union of the 1940s, which is when the camps reached their zenith, it would have been very difficult in many places to go about your daily business and not run into prisoners. It is no longer possible to argue, as once upon a time some Western historians did, that the camps would have been known only to a small proportion of the population. Everybody would have known they existed. We also understand better the chronology of these camps. We've long known that Lenin built the first ones in 1918 at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution. Originally, they were an ad hoc emergency measure designed to contain what he called enemies of the people. These were people who were opposed to the new Soviet system and to prevent counter-revolution and re-educate the bourgeoisie. And then that he and his successors expanded them to the Sovietsky Islands. These are some islands to the north of Russia in the White Sea in the early 1920s. But archives have also helped explain why Stalin chose to expand them in 1929. In that year, he launched the FiveYear Plan, which was an extraordinarily costly attempt in human lives and natural resources to force a 20% annual increase in the Soviet Union's industrial output and to collectivize agriculture. And this plan led to millions of arrests. Peasants were forced off their land, and they were imprisoned if they refused. It also led to an enormous labor shortage. Suddenly, the Soviet Union found itself in need of coal, gas, and minerals, most of which could be found only in the far north of the country, and it needed people to dig them out. So following a series of discussions, which used almost exclusively economic language to justify the expansion of the camps, the decision was taken. Prisoners should be used to extract the minerals. And to the secret policemen who were charged with carrying out the construction of the camps, this made sense. It seemed legitimate to them. And this is a very important point. I found a quote from the former deputy commander of one of the camps in Norilsk in the far north of the Arctic Circle, called Loginov, who justified the use of prisoner labor in a 1992 interview. He said, "If we had sent civilians, we would first have had to build houses for them to live in. And how could civilians live here? With a prisoner, it is easy. All you need is a barrack, a stove with a chimney, and they survive." prisoners in Gulag documents are often referred to as contingenti, just contingents, not as people. So from the point of view of the Soviet leadership and of the camp commanders and of the camp guards and of much of the population, the prisoners were a kind of ingredient in production, like lumps of coal or bars of steel. You know, enemies of the people didn't need to live like civilians in normal houses, and this made them both cheaper and more expendable. None of which is to say that the camps, in addition to their economic function, were not also intended to terrorize and subjugate the population. Certainly, prison and camp regimes, which were dictated in minute detail by Moscow, were openly designed to humiliate and dehumanize prisoners. So their belts and buttons and garters and items made of elastic were taken away from them. They were described as enemies. They were forbidden to use the word comrade, which was a kind of honorific in the Soviet Union. And these measures, I say, contributed to the dehumanization of prisoners in the eyes of the camp guards and bureaucrats, who therefore found it that much easier not to treat them as fellow citizens or even as human beings. In fact, this turned out to be an extremely powerful ideological combination, the disregarding of the humanity of the prisoners on the one hand, combined with the overwhelming need to fulfill this economic plan on the other. And this is very clear in camp inspection reports, which were submitted periodically by local prosecutors and are now kept very neatly on file in the Moscow archives. When I first began to read them, this is a while ago now, but I still remember how shocking it was. I was very surprised to discover both their frankness and the peculiar kind of outrage they express. So describing conditions in Volgolag, which is a railroad construction camp in Tatarstan in July 1942, one inspector complained, for example, and this is a quote, "The whole population of the camp, including free workers, lives off flour. The only meal for prisoners is so-called bread made from flour and water without meat or fats." As a result, the inspector went on indignantly. There were high rates of illness, particularly scurvy, and not surprisingly, the camp was failing to meet its production norms. So the prisoners are being badly fed, and therefore this camp is inefficient. And this outrage ceased to seem surprising to me after I'd read several dozen similar reports, each one of which used more or less the same kind of language, and each of which ended with more or less the same ritual conclusion. Conditions need to be improved so that prisoners will work harder and so that production norms will be met. Yet very little was ever actually done. While it might have been expected that living conditions in the Gulag were poor during the war, when they were very poor all over the Soviet Union, a nationwide inspection of 23 large camps in 1948 still concluded, among other things, that 75% of the prisoners in Norillag, that was one camp in northern Siberia, had no warm boots. The number of prisoners unfit for hard labor in Karelia had recently tripled, and death rates were still, quote unquote, too high in half a dozen camps, and that means too high to allow for efficient production. These reports, for those of you who know famous Russian play, The Inspector, the reports reminded me of the inspectors of Gogol's era and in Tsarist Russia. When the forms were observed, the reports were filed, but the effects on actual human beings were ignored. Camp commanders were routinely reprimanded for failing to improve living conditions. Living conditions, nevertheless, continued to fail to improve, and there the discussion ended. So the level of specificity clears up any doubt about who was in control of the camps, whether it was the central government or the regional bosses. In fact, back in Moscow, it was known what the camps were like, and it was known in great detail. But if so many people knew what happened at the time, the people who survived the camps, the people who ran the camps, if so many people, have read the extraordinary memoirs that were written about the camps, so many people must have had relatives in the camps. Why are they so rarely discussed in Russia today? And this question brings me to the next part of my talk, in which I would like to ask why the Gulag is so seldom debated and discussed in modern Russia. One of the things that always strikes contemporary visitors to Russia is the lack of monuments to Stalin's victims. particularly if you know what modern Germany looks like. In the city of Berlin, there's an enormous Holocaust memorial right in the center. Even scattered around the city, there's an amazing kind of memorial called stumble stones. These are little rocks that somehow stick out of the sidewalk and have been put in front of houses where Jews once lived who were deported during Hitler's Germany. And the idea is that you'll trip over them and then somehow remember what happened. You know, other parts of Europe, Warsaw is a city that's full of all kinds of memorials to the war, little mentions and so on. But in Russia, although there are plenty of war memorials, there are very few kind of scattered Gulag memorials. There is no national monument or place of mourning. And this absence of monuments does reflect an absence of public awareness. It's true that there were wide-ranging discussions of Soviet repression in the late 1980s during Gorbachev's reign, and it's equally true that these discussions played an important role in delegitimizing the Soviet regime. Those of you who've studied the fall of the Soviet Union know that one of the reasons it happened was that people ceased to believe in the ideology. They couldn't take it seriously anymore, and one of the reasons was this revelation of crimes that happened at the end of the 1980s when Gorbachev tried to open up the conversation. He had his policy called Glasnost was invoked, and people began to have real conversations about history, which had been forbidden up until then. Nevertheless, and there was in this period a kind of debate about justice for the victims, what should happen to them. But it's now over, this debate, and it has really left no political institutions, no kind of ongoing national discussion about memory whatsoever. So although there was a lot of talk about it at the end of the 1980s, the Russian government never did examine or try, put on trial the perpetrators of torture or mass murder in the Soviet system, even those who were identifiable. There were no truth commissions of the kind that were implemented in South Africa, which allowed people to tell their stories of victimization in public, and then therefore come to some kind of feeling of justice via that. There was no form of transitional justice at all. You know, the result is that half a century after the end of World War II, more than half a century now, the Germans still conduct regular public debates and conversations about victims' compensation, about memorials, about new interpretations of Nazi history, even about whether a younger generation of Germans ought to go on shouldering the burden of guilt about the crimes of what's now their grandparents and great-grandparents of the Nazis. Half a century after Stalin's death, there are no equivalent arguments taking place in Russia because that memory, the memory of that kind of past, is not a living part of public discourse. On the contrary, some of the very few existing museums and monuments that were put up in the 1990s, including a big Gulag museum based in a former camp, it's called at a place called Perm 36, are now being shut down. A lot of the archives that I used when I was doing my research are no longer accessible. They've been reclassified, and they're not available anymore to researchers. You know, at some level, the reasons for this lack of debate is maybe not that hard to fathom. The Stalinist era was a long time ago. A great deal has happened since it ended. Post-Soviet Russia is not the same as post-Soviet Germany, where the memories of the worst atrocities were still fresh in people's minds. Sorry, post-Nazi Germany, not post-Soviet Germany. The memory of the camps is also confused in Russia by the presence of so many other atrocities in Russian history. You know, the terrible experience of World War II there, terrible famines of the 1930s, the terrible legacy of collectivization. Some people think, well, you know, why should camp survivors get special treatment? But there's also an odd question of pride. You know, perhaps the old system was bad, many Russians now feel, but at least back then we were powerful. And now that we are not powerful, or we're not as powerful as we would like to be, we don't want to hear anymore that it was bad. The feeling that, we talked about that in the 1980s, it didn't get us anywhere. In the 1990s, we had this economic collapse. A lot of people feel that, you know, we just don't want to talk anymore about that part of the past. It's not useful, it's not productive. Still, I think that the most important explanation for the lack of debate is not really the fears and anxieties of ordinary Russians, many of whom, if you talk to them one-on-one, will of course know their grandfather was in a camp, or their cousin was, their cousin was in prison. People know these stories. So it's not so much that they don't want to talk about it, it's to do with the nature of the country's current ruling class. Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, is a former KGB officer who has described himself in the past as a Chekist, deliberately using a word that was once used for Lenin's political police. This was the original secret police in Russia. They were called Chekists. Later on, they evolved, and later on they were called the KGB. But he uses this word, which was once a word that evoked fear and hatred and anxiety. He uses that as kind of, I'm proud to have been a Chekist. Famously, the Russian president has also described the breakup of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, presumably meaning greater than World War I or World War II. Under his watch, Soviet flags have returned to anniversary parades, the Soviet national anthem has been revived, and now the reconstruction of the Soviet Empire is at the center of Russia's foreign policy. His intentions, I think, are pretty clear. Putin is now trying to create an alternative version of post-Soviet history, really the history of the last 20 years, that supports his ideology and supports the idea that he should be in power. So thus, 1989, which was the year when the Soviet Empire ended, is not now described in Russia as a moment of liberation. It's remembered as the beginning of economic collapse. 1991, which was the year the Soviet Union broke up, is not something to rejoice over and remember as a great moment of progress. It's remembered as a great tragedy. The hardships and the deprivations of the 1990s, and when Russia genuinely went through economic convulsion, are not remembered as the result of, the inevitable result, really, of decades of the Communist Party's bad policies and widespread thievery. They're remembered instead as caused by Western-style capitalism and democracy. The idea is that communism was stable and safe. Post-communism has been a disaster. The Soviet Union was great. Russia, at least until now, has been a failure, but Putin is going to revive it. And the more people believe all of this, the less likely they are to want a system which is more genuinely democratic and genuinely capitalist than the one Russia has now, which I believe is, of course, it's not democratic, and neither is it really anything we would recognize as capitalism. It doesn't start from the premise of rule of law. There's no equal playing field. There's no entrepreneurship without connections. But the more nostalgia that Putin can evoke for Soviet-era symbols, the more secure he and his KGB clique are going to be. I think it's not an accident that the piece of Soviet history that he has chosen to celebrate, in other words, many things happened over 90 years of Bolshevik, 80 years of Bolshevik rule in Russia. The piece that he's chosen to celebrate is the moment of victory over the Germans. So as I said, there's once a year, there's an anniversary parade on May the 9th, and Russian soldiers dress up in Soviet uniforms, they wave Soviet flags, and they celebrate the victory over Germany, but it's also celebration of the moment when Russia was an empire. Russian troops were in Berlin, Stalin controlled half of Europe. This is the moment of kind of pride that he's trying to evoke. So he, if I may say so, and the original idea of make Russia great again was Putin's. He harks back to a previous era. He works on people's nostalgia, and that's how he's trying to use history. He doesn't want history to be studied or discussed. The archives are closed. He wants it to be something that's part of his, part of legitimizing why he remains in power. This failure to repent, or discuss, or even to dwell on the past is part of this redirecting of history towards the political needs of the present rulers. I think it's also had consequences for the formation of Russian civil society and the development of the rule of law. It helps explain, for example, why so many Russians are not as bothered as they should be by the return of censorship in Russia, by the FSB is the organization that replaced the KGB, why they're not bothered by its ability to open mail and tap telephones and enter private residences. I think there's a deeper significance too. To put it bluntly, if the scoundrels of the old regime remain unpunished, if their crimes are never, there's no justice, good will in no way ever be seen to have triumphed over evil, and the feeling that of people's moral feelings can't be assuaged. And this may sound apocalyptic, but it's not politically irrelevant. After 1991, the secret police kept their apartments, their dachas, and their large pensions, and their victims remained poor and marginal. To most Russians, it now seems as if the more you collaborated in the past, the smarter you were. And by analogy, the more you cheat and lie and steal in the present, the more clever you are. So at the fundamental heart, one of the reasons why Russia is the way it is, why it's so profoundly corrupt, I think, is this failure to acknowledge or understand what happened there in the Stalin period. But do we in the West remember the Soviet past any better? One of the reasons I wrote my Gulag book, I wrote a history of the Gulag that was published, it's got 15 years ago now, but one of the reasons I wrote it was because I really encountered this subject only while I was living in Eastern Europe. As a journalist, I was based in Poland in the 1980s and early 1990s. And as I traveled around the region and I began to understand what had happened there, I tried to understand why. I think until recently, it was possible to explain our own lack of popular feeling and knowledge about the tragedy of European communism as the logical result of a particular set of circumstances. So again, the passage of time is part of it. Communist regimes really did grow less reprehensible as the years went by. Nobody was very frightened of General Jaruzelski, who was the last leader of communist Poland, or even of Brezhnev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union during this period of stagnation, although both were responsible for a lot of destruction. In the Soviet era, archives were closed, access to campsites was forbidden. There were no television cameras that ever filmed the Soviet camps or their victims, as happened in Germany at the end of the Second World War. And no images, in turn, meant that the subject in our image-driven culture didn't really exist either. Once upon a time, ideology did twist the ways in which we understood Soviet and East European history as well. In fact, there's an interesting piece of historiography. In the 1920s, a great deal was known in the West about the bloodiness of Lenin's revolution. And Western socialists on the left, many of whose brethren had been jailed by the Bolsheviks. One of the first things the Bolsheviks did when they came to power was arrest the Social Democrats. They protested loudly and strongly against the crimes of the Russian Revolution. But in the 1930s, as Americans and West Europeans became more interested in learning how what they called socialism, which was of course something different, but how it could be applied here, the tone changed. So lots of writers and journalists went off to the USSR trying to learn lessons that they could use at home. The New York Times employed a correspondent in Moscow, Walter Duranty, who lauded Stalin's 5-year plan and argued against all the evidence that it was a massive success, and he won a Pulitzer Prize for doing so. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, a part of the Western left struggled to explain and sometimes excuse the camps and the terror that created them, precisely because they wanted to try some aspects of central planning, some aspects of the Soviet experiment at home. But it's not just the left. Our determination to ignore and not write about Soviet terror solidified even further during the Second World War when Stalin was our ally. So in 1944, the American Vice President, Henry Wallace, actually went to Kolyma, which was one of the most notorious camps, kind of camp systems. It was a part of Russia, northeast Russia, where there were hundreds and hundreds of camps. During a trip across the USSR, he went to visit there, and imagining he was visiting some kind of industrial complex, he told his hosts that Soviet Asia, which is what he called it, reminded him of the Wild West. So the vast expanses of your country, her virgin forests, wide rivers and large lakes, all kinds of climate from tropical to polar, her inexhaustible wealth remind me of my homeland. And according to a report that the boss of Kolyma later wrote for the Soviet secret police, Wallace did ask to see prisoners, so he knew there were some there, but he was kept away. But he really wasn't alone in refusing to see the truth about Stalin's system or not wanting to see it. Remember that Roosevelt and Churchill had their photographs taken with Stalin too. Their joint, we were allies together against Hitler, and many things were excused on that basis. Indeed, all of that contributed to our firm conviction that the Second World War was a wholly just war, in which we, the Democrats, beat the fascists. And even today, very few people want that conviction shaken. So what do we remember when we remember World War II? We remember D-Day, the liberation of the Nazi concentration camps. We remember children welcoming American GIs with cheers on the streets. And we do not remember that the camps of Stalin, our ally, expanded, just as the camps of Hitler, our enemy, were liberated. Nobody really wants to think that we defeated one mass murderer with the help of another. During the Cold War, it's true, our awareness of Soviet atrocities went up, but in the 1960s, they went down again. Even in the 1980s, there were still American academics who went on describing the advantages of East German healthcare or Soviet peace initiatives. In the academic world, historians who wrote about the Soviet Union sometimes, some wrote about the camps as criminal, some downplayed them, not necessarily because they themselves were pro-Soviet, but because they were opposed to America's role in the Cold War, or maybe they didn't like Ronald Reagan. So what I'm trying to say is that right up into the very end, our views of the Soviet Union and our understanding of what was happening there always had a lot more to do with American politics and American ideological struggles than they did with the Soviet Union itself. I would suggest that there's something similar happening today with China. The Chinese have set up a vast system of camps, once again, in a part of Xinjiang province where Uyghurs, who are a Muslim minority there, who are considered very dangerous by the Chinese, are kept in large numbers. And it's simply not an issue that rises to the top of American political conversation because our concerns with China are different and our politics are about something else right now. So we're not thinking about this, although someday perhaps we might. Of course, since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, a lot of things have changed. World War II now belongs to a previous generation. The Cold War is over as well, and the alliances and international fault lines that it produced have shifted for good. The Western left and the Western right now compete over totally different issues. And I think that it is actually possible now for us to look at the history of the Soviet Union, not through the narrow lens of Western politics, but to see it how it was. I mean, you all are really one of the first generations that can read this history and look at it from a kind of objective perspective. It's not about your views of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. You can look at it. You can try and understand it for what it was and try and understand why it happened. It's possible, and I would say that it's necessary. It's true that our tolerance for the occasional Gulag denier in our universities will not destroy the moral fabric of our society, and even, lots of people get upset about it, but I don't even think the fashion for hammer and sickle communist symbol t-shirts are going to corrupt anybody. But I do think that our failure to incorporate what we now know about the Gulag into our own memory of Europe and our own memory of Western politics, if we can't do that, there will be consequences, because after all, it was a part of our history too. Why did we fight the Cold War after all? Was it because, crazed right-wing politicians, in cahoots with the military-industrial complex and the CIA invented the whole thing and forced 2 generations of Americans to go along with it? Or was there something more important at stake? I'm not sure that we still remember what it was that mobilized us, what inspired us, and what held the civilization of the West together for so long. At the same time, I also think that if we don't study the history of the Gulag, some of what we know about mankind itself will be distorted. Every single one of the 20th century's massacres was unique. The Gulag, the Holocaust, the Armenian Massacre, the Nanking Massacre, the Cultural Revolution, the Cambodian Revolution, the Bosnian Wars. Each one of these events had different historical and philosophical origins. Each one arose in circumstances that will never be repeated. But our ability to debase and destroy and dehumanize our fellow men has been and will be repeated again and again. You know, our transformation of our neighbors into enemies, our reinvention of our victims as lower or lesser or evil human beings, worthy only of incarceration or expulsion or death, this never changes. So the more we understand about how different societies have transformed their neighbors and fellow citizens into objects, the more we know about the specific circumstances that led to each one of these episodes of mass murder, the better I think we'll understand the darker side of our own human nature. I wrote my book about the Gulag not so that it will not happen again, as the cliche has it, because it will happen again. It is happening again. And we need to know why, and each story and each memoir and each document is a piece of the puzzle. And without them, we will one day wake up and realize that we don't know who we are. Thank you very much.
Thank you again, Professor Applebaum. Our tradition here is to have a discussion, a series of questions before the reception. And traditionally, we begin with student questions first. So if a student...
no faculty.
What?
No faculty
no
hogging
faculty.
the...
No faculty getting up, because they don't ask questions, they just make speeches, right? So students...
You have smart faculty. I
well,
listen to their speeches.
we'll see. We'll see. Jim, not yet, not yet. Okay, a student.
Silence.
There we go.
There we go. By the way, I'm happy to answer questions about other things I've written or other parts of my career. It doesn't have to just be about the Gulag. But anyway, go ahead.
So going forward, how do you think that we can incorporate, learning more about the Gulag and what happened into our education systems? Because I didn't really learn about that in my education. So how do you think we can incorporate that more?
So I've actually been I was part of a project to create curricula for high school on this subject. And I realize that it's difficult. I mean, most American students in particular don't do much world history or European history in school. You know, you tend to do American history, if you do history at all. It's a problem that I hope a lot of universities or colleges like this one can rectify. It seems to me that it would be useful for every high school student to do European history in a way that focused on, the tragic pieces of European history that have affected us. I think Americans have lost quite a lot of their memory and understanding of why we've been engaged in the rest of the world for so long. Why did we intervene in the European wars? Why were we part of World War I and World War II? It would be very useful for high schools to return to the subject for exactly the reason that I said in the lecture, which is, if we don't know anything about Soviet history and we don't know what it was, then how can we even understand our own history? How do we understand our own Cold War if we don't know what it was that we were fighting? So I would hope eventually high schools would begin to understand that. But of course, anybody can rectify their own gaps in their own history. There are so many great books to read. If you don't want to read my book, you can read. There are fantastic Gulag memoirs. There are a lot of really good. One of the great advantages of the collapse of the Soviet Union is that there has been a fantastic, kind of outpouring of really good books about Russian history over the last couple of decades. A friend of mine, Simon Sebag Montefiore, has written a couple of biographies of Stalin, which are sort of rip-roaring, gossip-filled reads describing his swashbuckling youth in the Caucasus. I mean, you can really find a huge range of things to read. And anybody who is at a college like this one, I'm sure, will, want to make up gaps in whatever it is that they know. But you can make those up at any time in your life. There are always books to read. Another question.
Hi, thank you for coming out today. Could you just describe your time living in Eastern Europe and what was a kind of a tense political climate between the East and the West?
Gosh, so I moved to Warsaw in the fall of 1988. And I wasn't very much older than you are. I had just graduated. I'd spent a year at graduate school, and then I was supposed to write a PhD, and then I dropped out. And I moved to Warsaw to be a journalist. And this was a time when nobody thought it was a very interesting story. So Warsaw at that time was a communist country. It had been occupied by Soviet troops since the war. But it was also a country where there was a big opposition, kind of underground opposition movement. There had been a big revolt in 1980 and 81, and there were kind of hints that things were beginning to happen. And I moved to Warsaw then to be a stringer, so I didn't have a real job. I think I was paid, I remember it because it was a round number, I think I was paid something like $100 a month as a stipend, which was plenty of money to live on in Warsaw in 88. I mean, I earned extra money by writing, but this was my kind of, and then they paid my expenses. It was an arrangement like that. And one of the oddities of that moment was, a lot of things seem obvious in retrospect. When you look back on history, of course communism was going to collapse. Of course it was a terrible system. Of course it didn't work. In the autumn of 1988, no one knew that was going to happen, and as far as we all knew, it was going to go on forever. So every event, that took place was a surprise. And when I arrived, the first big story, the first that I covered, I think it was 22 or something, but the first big story that I wrote about was Margaret Thatcher's visit to Warsaw. And this is in autumn of 1988, and if you remember, Mrs. Thatcher was the Prime Minister of Britain who was a great promoter of free markets and was herself a great anti-communist. And she was allowed to come to, the fact that she was allowed to come to Warsaw, that the Polish government let her visit, was considered to be a kind of great, breakthrough. The fact that she was even there was a big deal. And she arrived wearing, she looked like the Tsarina. She wore this long black fur coat, and she had a kind of black hat, which I guess was her East European outfit. And she arrived in Warsaw, and she did two sets of meetings, one with the Polish government, which was then the communist government that was led by someone called General Jaruzelski, who had, a few years ago, had inflicted martial law in Poland in order to stop demonstrations. And then she went up to meet some of the dissidents in Gdańsk. Some of you may have heard of Lech Wałęsa. He was the leader of the Solidarity movement, the opposition. She went to meet them. And I'll tell you two stories about it. One was what she did in Warsaw. Her idea was she was going to come to Warsaw and be an advertisement for the West and for the free markets. And so she went, at that time, Poland had just opened up a little bit to allow a little bit of private enterprise, and there were these private farmers markets in the central part of the city. And so she decided she would visit one of the farmers markets to sort of show, approval for this amazing piece of capitalism. And it was kind of people selling pickles and, beets and, potatoes. But she arrived at this, there was this huge press corps following her, and she arrived at this farmer's market, and there was kind of pandemonium. People were screaming, come here, trying to get her to buy their stuff, and of course, she had no money with her because she's the prime minister, and so she was kind of walking around the market, sort of saying, I'll have that, I'll have that, I'll have that, and then the British ambassador was scurrying behind her, kind of paying for stuff, and journalists were taking pictures, and I mean, that was like this. It's hard to describe now, but hard to understand now. But it was considered this big breakthrough. Margaret Thatcher goes shopping in Warsaw. Then she went up to visit Wałęsa in Gdańsk, and she had a meeting with lots of the leaders of Solidarity, which was the Polish opposition movement. I think they met at a church in Gdańsk, and they were, and she was talking to them, and and this somebody told me later on, someone who worked for her years later told me that they were very open and vocal about what they wanted. We want you to help us change the system, and there's talk of having free elections, and she kept pointing at the ceiling. She assumed that there was bugs in the room, and she kept, tape recorders. Somebody was listening, and she kept saying, "Shh, looking at the ceiling." And they were all like, "Why shouldn't She was more concerned about the communist spies who she thought were spying on them than they were. They didn't care anymore. So this was a lot of this sounds sort of provincial and silly, but this was the moment when suddenly a lot of things became fluid and began to seem more possible. The Soviet Union, in Poland, the whole system was completely discredited and had been for a really long time. And Poland was, I think, was about to be used by the Soviet Union as an experiment. In other words, Gorbachev was kind of playing with the idea, how do we give some legitimacy to the system? Because his idea was to try and rescue communism. So he let the Poles experiment with an election. And let's have a partially free election. And over the next year, that unfolded. And there was a decision made to have an election, and there were some free candidates were allowed, and the solidarity candidates were allowed to stand. And then what happened was that the Polish public, who nobody really knew what they thought, whether they supported communism, and overwhelmingly voted for the opposition. And this somehow destabilized the system, and there was an agreement to let them create the first non-communist government, which then happened that summer, August of 1989. You finally had the first non-communist government, and this was really the tipping point that led to a whole series of things that eventually culminating in the fall of the Berlin Wall, which I was also at, which is another story. But no, but it was the experience I'd like to recreate for you is this constant surprise. There was this system that we thought was totally closed, and it can never be altered, and it seemed totally dead, and it was defended by policemen and tanks and so on. And then suddenly, like from one day to the next, it was possible to change it. And it's just a little reminder that a lot of things that seem permanent now, whether it's Putin in Russia or whether it's, or whether it's the Communist Party in China, a lot of things that seem permanent might not be. That's really the lesson of 1989. Okay, there's a. Oh, sorry? Policies or puzzles? Puzzles.
Couple of historical puzzles. First, when I was a graduate student, even more when I was an undergraduate, the dominant theory was hard anti-communism, which is more than just being very, very anti-communist. It means communism is incapable of change. That actually was an idea with a Marxist genealogy, although it traveled rightward.
Yeah, the Marxists believe that once you're a Marxist, that's it.
But they'll believe you've got the economy and the state in the same hands. You're frozen. That was the Marxist version of hard anti-communism. It got some more metaphysical stuff when it moved rightward. And it just turned out not to be true. My first historical puzzle is why. The second historical puzzle is Stalin did the one thing that a dictator normally cannot afford to do. He made a massive strategic mistake and Russia ended up invaded. Practically any dictator in the world would have a bullet in his head.
Why didn't they shoot him?
Why didn't they shoot him? Why did they, in fact, instead of not shooting him, rally behind him and kick the Germans out and continue to march westward?
So the second question I don't really have an answer to. It's pretty clear that he thought they would shoot him. So to those of you who don't know, this is the very beginning. When World War II broke out, we don't always remember it exactly this way, but in 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, and the Soviet Union also invaded Poland. And there was actually a pact between Hitler and Stalin that was meant to be permanent, that they were going to divide Eastern Europe between them. And then in 1941, Hitler surprised Stalin by invading the Soviet Union. And Stalin, for several days, disappeared. He couldn't be found. He was staying in one of his dachas, and he didn't emerge. And this is because he thought, now they're going to kill me. That's what we think happened. But the people around him were either they were so genuinely in awe of him, or still somehow afraid of him, or they believed he was a strategic genius, which I think they did believe, and they just rallied behind him, as you say, and he took charge again. why that happened, I mean, I don't have an explanation. You would have to go into the psychology of the various players. I mean, the other question, which is, so yes, it was thought that once a country has become a Marxist-Leninist state, once it has become a communist state, it can't be changed. It's sort of frozen in time because that system was one of total control. It was one that aspired to be totalitarian, which means that they controlled not just politics and not just economics, but everything. They controlled schools, education, the arts, communications. I mean, art and literature had to be done in a it was called social realism in a special Soviet style. There were no independent organizations. There were no independent football teams. There were no independent arts clubs. There was no such thing as a free organization or independent association in the Soviet Union. And they were very limited in Central Europe as well. And so everyone assumed that this kind of totalitarian control worked. In other words, you can, if you allow people only one sort of information, they will be brainwashed, and then that will be the end of the society. So it turned out that this kind of rather simplistic idea of how the human brain works was wrong. And also it turned out that totalitarianism, they may have tried to control everything, and they may have tried to control what people saw and heard and so on, but in fact, they never really succeeded. And in another book I wrote, which was a book called Iron Curtain, which is about the Soviet imposition of the Soviet system on Eastern Europe, I talk about some of those things. I mean, they couldn't control jokes. So there was a whole underground culture of telling jokes and mocking the authorities. People did find ways to, the other thing is if you make every form of independent activity into a political, political statement, then almost everything becomes political. So in other words, in the Czech Republic, in communist Czechoslovakia, people would form jazz bands, and the jazz bands became these fantastic political, anti-government, organizations. In Poland, they created independent trade unions, and these became independent anti-communist organizations. Going to church became a political act because the church was one of the few independent institutions in Poland. So their attempt to control everything just didn't work. And then, of course, the other important point was that their economic theory never worked either. And so it turned out that centralizing everything and making all the decisions in one place and determining, how many widgets are going to be made in Krasnoyarsk and how many, cars are going to be built in Novosibirsk. This was a disastrous way to run an economy, and the Soviet Union did fall further and further behind the West, and people could see that. And it was particularly clear in Eastern Europe where they did travel and they could see, Germany is richer than we are. How is that right? So I think the ideology didn't live up to its promises. We were supposed to make people wealthier than the West, and it didn't. And the attempts to control everything, everything about what everybody saw and heard and thought also didn't work. And people somehow found ways around this, and the system simply lost credibility. And I mean, really, I mean, in Berlin, for example, from literally one day to another, it collapsed. It was there. East Germany was there one day, and it seemed like it would be there forever. And the Berlin Wall divided the city, and then literally 24 hours later, it was gone. So it all happened with great speed.
Just in your opinion, do you think like China is doing what Russia was doing in after World War II, currently right now?
So no, I think the current modern China, I mean, this is not Mao's era China, but modern China is a different kind of society, and it's not attempting to be a totalitarian society. So the Chinese don't try to control everything. I've been to China a couple of times. And you can give a talk at a bookstore or a public space in China, and you can be critical of the regime, and nobody will come and arrest you, and nobody's actually even particularly scared. So if you're used to thinking of the old Soviet Union, in which people were scared and they were afraid to say anything critical, it doesn't feel like that. I do think in China that if you try and organize a mass movement, or if you try to create some politics, then you get in trouble. But actually just speaking and being critical and telling jokes and so on, that doesn't get you locked up. What China really is a new kind of authoritarianism. Also, it's another complication about generalizing about China is that it's so big, and different pieces of it are run in different ways. But so, there's a lot of freedom and energy in the cities, and people are very westernized, and they have lots of access to information, and they're able to own companies and act very much like Western entrepreneurs. Whereas in other parts of the country, that's not. I mentioned Xinjiang, but there are other parts of the country where that's not true. So it's very big and disconnected. But it is an authoritarian state, and it does function with a different mentality from a liberal democracy, and we are, I think, increasingly going to clash with, even if we didn't want to, we will clash with China's ambitions. China has an ambition to be a world power. It is a world power, but it will increasingly want to see that. To see its status reflected in the rules of the way the world works, and that will come into conflict with that. It's very important to understand China. I'm not a China expert at all, but I hope some of you will be.
What follows Putin?
Sorry?
What follows Putin
What
in
follows
Russia?
him? Very hard to say. One of the weird things about Russia, and this is, by the way, not a recent problem, but this goes back about 500 years, all the way through the Romanov dynasty, is that it's, the strange thing about Putin, it's not so much that we don't know who will replace him eventually. We also don't know how that person will be chosen. So there's no succession mechanism. So that we didn't know what is the mechanism by which, who will choose it. Is it the elites? Will it be an accident? Will it be he himself? Will there be some kind of collapse and national, revolution? And we actually don't know how his, what will happen. Even if he just dies peacefully in his bed, which is perfectly possible, we don't know how the next person will be chosen, and that makes it very hard to predict. If I were to guess now, I would guess that Russia's an extraordinarily, really, people talk about inequality in this country, but it's extraordinarily unequal, in which you have really a few hundred people own most of the wealth of the country, 80% or something. And it would be my guess that someone from that elite leadership group will be the next leader. There are a lot of people in that group who don't like Putin, and who particularly don't like his anti-Western language and activity. A lot of, kind of senior wealthy Russians don't like, they hate the sanctions. They hate the fact that they can't live in their houses in London. They would like to deal with the West, and they'd rather have a better and different relationship with us. So while I don't feel like a huge amount of optimism about democracy in Russia, I don't think it's impossible that someday we'll have a better relationship with Russia. One of the interesting things that's going to happen over the next decade is watching the relationship with Russia and China. I think the Russians are very afraid of the Chinese. They're afraid of Chinese power, and at some point, it might occur to them that it would be, better to be on our side than theirs. But maybe they'll draw the opposite conclusion.
I was thanks for your talk, by the way. Given what you said about how widely known the camps were in the Soviet Union, everybody had a relative who...
You must have had a cousin, yeah.
Right, so how much did Western intelligence know during the 1940s about what was happening in the camps?
So it's a fascinating question. We did know things. As I said, we knew, in the 1920s, we knew about the first camps, and there were people who got out and things that we knew. In the 1940s, we knew a lot because during the war, some prisoners, this is explained in my book, it's a long story, there were a group of Polish prisoners who were in the Gulag who were let out, let out because there was a truce between the Polish government in exile and the Soviet government, and they decided to let some Poles out of the camps. And they left the Gulag, and they wound up traveling out of the Soviet Union via Iran, and many wound up fighting with the British Army elsewhere in the world. But a lot of them, there was actually a big project, which is still, you can still read it at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. There was a big project to document what had happened to them. So there was a lot of, and they were very, they described the camps, they explained what they were like. So there was, certainly in the 1940s, we knew quite a bit about them. I mean, if you want, it's actually almost a different question, because if you wanted to know about them, if you sought out the information, you could have found it. But, knowledge about things doesn't really work like that. What we all know isn't just a function of kind of what knowledge is available out there. It's also a function of how is it part of the public conversation? Is it written about by journalists in the mainstream press? To who sees it and to whom is it available? So, there are different levels of knowing. And while certainly some people knew, I don't know that most people knew. And then, as I said, there's this bizarre thing that happens with American politics, which is we sort of know in the 40s, and in the 50s, there's with McCarthyism, there's a kind of anti-communist hysteria in the United States, and people talk about how terrible communism is. And then that kind of dies down in the 1960s, and people want to find good things to say again about the Soviet Union. And all of this is more to do with US politics than it is Soviet politics. So the kind of rise and fall of our interest and knowledge about the system is a lot more to do with us than them. And I think that's very true, again, I said it already, but I think it's very true of how we feel different things about China at different times, very often having more to do with arguments here than there. But yeah, you could have known, and certainly by the 1950s there were memoirs published. Having said that, when Solzhenitsyn's book, The Gulag Archipelago, was published in, I think it's 1973, it appears, people found it shocking. In France it was a sensation. We had no idea, and yet information was available all along. So.
Hi, I'm going to ask you a question in an accent that you are familiar with, probably a little bit. I'm Polish. But the question is about Brexit. Could you comment on the role Russia played in Brexit, if any?
So it's a fascinating subject. Russia did do in the Brexit referendum, they followed a similar, they did something similar to what was done here. I think probably not at quite a big a scale, in that they created fake accounts, they created fake pro-Brexit accounts. They used their state media, which is RT, this Russian television station, and Sputnik, to create sort of narratives about Brexit, and those were then pumped out by these bots and troll farms and so on. My instinct, and I may someday be proven wrong, I don't have any, but my instinct is that they didn't make that much difference in that sense to the campaign, because there was so much kind of junk information about Brexit anyway that was being put out by the Leave campaign that I don't even know that the Russians, could have had that much of an impact in terms of the online, the kind of online conversation. Having said that, there's one other thing that still isn't quite resolved, but is very odd looking, which is that the main funder of the the Leave campaign, is a British businessman called Aaron Banks, who has a very, very weird and opaque source of income, including, he says he has diamond mines and they don't seem to actually have any diamonds in them. And he keeps all of his money offshore in these secret accounts, and we don't really know where his money from, and there's some circumstantial evidence that he may have some Russian connections that we don't know about. And he spent a lot of time at the Russian embassy, and they seem to have offered him some kind of investment, and he says he didn't take the investment. We don't really know. Anyway, we're still wading through that story. I mean, actually just goes to show 3 years later, the British haven't gotten to the bottom of that piece of the story. I mean, did the Russian government want Brexit to happen? Yeah, I mean, look what Brexit has done to Great Britain. The country has completely turned in on itself. It isn't talking about anything else. For 2 years, this is the only subject. Britain has been taken out of the world conversation. It's not part of the discussion about the future of NATO or the future of Syria. Suddenly it's kind of gone as a country. And that has been, the real damage of Brexit, I think, is that. I mean, I'm much more worried about that than about economic damage. The economic damage, okay, they'll have to rewire their trading and they'll have to change it, and it'll be bad for a lot of people. But it's not. I don't think it's as bad as the the kind of the geopolitical damage of removing Britain, which is what's happened. And and by the way, somebody asked me this morning, Brexit is still. I mean, I follow it pretty closely. I live in London, actually. I don't know if that's clear, but that's where I live. And I have lots of friends who are both reporters and who are in politics. And nobody right now, nobody knows how it ends. I mean, there's no, they've so thrown up it's such a messy debate, and there's so many different arguments about what the relationship between Britain and the EU should be, that there is 10 days away from what was supposed to be the deadline. It's not clear what's going to happen. It's very weird. Maybe one more? Yes.
Oh, yeah, this kind of goes back to a couple questions before, but how do you think Russia would respond to the whole rise in, like, democratic socialism that's in America right now? Like, what would happen if, like, Bernie Sanders were elected, or?
I don't know. I mean, they don't do socialism anymore in Russia, so. I mean, I don't know. I mean, we know that there was some Russian backing for Jill Stein, right? So that we know that they're interested in spoiler candidates. I don't have any, I'm sure they don't support Bernie Sanders, or I don't have any fears about that. I mean, I would say that one of the outcomes that would be good for Russia of anybody who's the next, would be to have another president, whether it's Trump or somebody else, who wants to take America out of Europe and sort of remove America more from world events. I mean, that's what Russia wants. They want the United States out of Europe. They want NATO to be dissolved. They want, because for Russia, if Russia speaks to any European country, so even Germany, so Russia and Germany, or Russia and France, or Russia and Poland, or Russia, Russia and Norway, Russia, in that kind of conversation, Russia is always dominant. It's always the dominant partner, or at the very least equal partner. Russia talking to NATO, or Russia talking to the European Union, Russia is the minor partner. Because together, Europe, and certainly, and more importantly, Europe and the United States, are much bigger, much more powerful, much more influential. And so Russia would like to break up these institutions because it will be, this Putin, I would say, not Russians, because because it will be good for him. And the second reason, Russia's other big strategic objective is, I mean, this is for a longer conversation sometime, but what does Putin fear the most about the West? He doesn't fear our tanks. I don't think he thinks we're going to invade them. What he's really afraid of is the rhetoric of democracy and the power of the idea that, the people should have a say in politics. Because that's the one thing, that's the weakness of his current government, because it's profoundly undemocratic and kleptocratic. And he is afraid of democracy rhetoric, which is why he was so upset about the demonstrations in Ukraine in 2014 that led to the Ukrainian president fled the country, because that's what were those demonstrators doing? They were waving European flags and they were calling for an end to corruption. That's the kind of demonstration he's afraid of. So the more he can disqualify democracy, sort of undermine it, undermine the idea of the West, the power of the West, the more he can kind of eliminate that as a temptation for Russians. Russians feel themselves to be Europeans, and so they are attracted by what they perceive to be European ideas. And if he can kind of besmirch those, then that's good for him. So I think, any next U.S. president who wanted to take America out of world politics they would be fine with.
I would ask you to join me in thanking Professor Applebaum for a great lecture. I'd also like to invite you all to join us and continue the conversation in the Great Room, where there will be a reception. Please come.